Hello, everybody. Welcome to our series on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah called New Normals Are Messy. This is the midweek message from Messiah Lutheran Church in Mechanicsville, Virginia. My name is Pastor Ryan Radke, and new normals are indeed messy. Anybody who's ever moved or just gone through construction or even recovered from something much more serious like an illness or a death or loss of a job, anything, when you're trying to find that new normal, it's usually not a straight path from point A to point B. There's other obstacles and unexpected things, and there's adjustment periods and all of that. So new normals can be good, but they can also almost always be messy. We're talking about this because the books of Ezra and Nehemiah um, parallel a little bit about what we're going through right now in our world and in our church communities. We're returning to sanctuaries, we're returning to church activities after a long time of being apart from one another and having our routines and our practices disrupted. And there's even now concerns and worries that they're getting disrupted again, and new mask recommendations and variant COVID cases on the rise, and more debates and things like that. So we know for a fact that things just won't go back to normal overnight. They haven't so far. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell the unique history of Israel's return to Jerusalem and the surrounding towns following around 70 years of exile in Babylon. Um, Not the same, 70 years, a year and a half, pandemic, political, religious exile, not the same. But in both cases, the returning and the rebuilding processes um, can be and were messy, to say the least. We're spending these weeks, I don't know how many weeks it'll end up being, 5 or 6 total, um, looking at these two books together. They were originally, uh, and still in Jewish Bibles, Hebrew Bibles, considered to be one unit. For some reason, in our Bibles, they're split into two. Um, but we're looking at these two books together, and we're going to see what the living word that is our scripture has to teach us from their experiences to our situation today. We prayerfully look for that intersection between their context and ours. Today we're going to look at chapters 7 through 10 of Ezra, and things get even messier still in these 4 chapters. Um, we're going to pick up the narrative now that construction on the temple has resumed. You might recall last week that there had been some delays. The peoples of the land, that is, the descendants of those who hadn't been taken into exile, either those that stayed in the area or others who moved in, they objected to the Israelites moving back in and just reestablishing things after so long gone. Um, the folks that stayed behind or moved in, they were happy with their control of the land and their worship practices, their everything. So at first, we heard last week, they tried to get involved in the building process. Hey, let us help. But the Jewish leaders gave them a firm no. Um, these leaders in Jerusalem and Judah wanted to maintain a pure remnant in charge. After being gone for so long, that can make sense. However, it leads to problems. The people of the land then protested directly to Persia, who were the new empire in charge. And then after some back and forth last week and some checking of records in Persia, the building project was delayed for a time, but by the end of chapter 6, they're back in business with the full backing of Persia. They're on a roll now. So now we pick up in chapter 7, and we're going to read verses 1 through 6 and then skip over to verse 10. So here we are. After this, in the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, Ezra, son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, son of Zadok, Zadok, son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, son of Marioth, son of Zerahiah, son of Uzi, son of Buki, son of Abishua, son of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of the chief priest Aaron. This Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, and that the Lord God. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, that the Lord, the God of Israel. I made it through all the names, but I trip over that. I mean, come on. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. In verse 10. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach the statutes and ordinances in Israel. So Ezra officially arrives on the scene in chapter 7. I think I may have mentioned his name a couple times last week, just referring to the leadership in Israel, but this is his official arrival on the scene. We get to hear his lineage, traced back all the way to Aaron, who was the first high priest, Moses' brother, and we also get to hear Ezra's credentials, a scholar and a scribe skilled in the law of Moses. Just as Aaron spoke on Moses' behalf to the people, Ezra is ready to speak on behalf of the law of Moses, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. He's ready to speak on behalf of the law of Moses to the people as they reestablish Israel and rededicate themselves to God. Ezra had been in Babylon along with a lot of the other exiles. He wasn't in Persia, but he is brought up from Babylon and sent down to Judah, and he brings with him a second wave of returning exiles. Verse 6 says that the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. Question. In what ways have you felt God's hand upon you or on our congregation as a whole, both during the last year and a half and now? Sometimes I'll talk about these things as God sightings. Where you see God at work right now, could be unexpected places, people, nature, church, kindness. Uh, who knows? God could be working, probably is working on all these fronts, but where are you picking up on it? So where have you felt God's hand on you, guiding you in this last year and a half, as we're just figuring things out as we go, as there's all these restrictions and everything else, all these worries and fears and angst? And where are you feeling God's hand now? I can say I felt it, and surprisingly, in some committee meetings. Um, Committee meetings probably aren't everybody's first thought as to, yeah, that'll be great. But as the committees of Messiah have been getting back together for the first time in a long time to really kind of take stock of where they are and get excited about the future, I have seen and felt God's hand at work there. I'm not sure exactly in which direction we're going yet, but I know God is guiding us, and there's been some exciting conversations and there's been some exciting ideas. So I'm feeling God at that. That's one example. And clearly here we are doing this online. I think maybe God's hand has been at work in that. A lot of congregations and churches around the world have been using videos and stuff for a long time, but for a lot of smaller congregations and folks that hadn't crossed that bridge yet, here we are. So getting the word out there in new ways, I think God's working on that too. How about yourselves? Where have you felt God's hand? One other question on this section. In verse 10, we hear that Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach the statutes and ordinances in Israel. Ezra's verbs are to study, do, and teach. So I wonder, oh, just lost my place. See how you hit a button and you mess everything up. So I wonder, as Ezra's verbs are to study, do, and teach. My question is, what are the main verbs we are prioritizing right now in our time and place as we return to the building, but also as we kind of rededicate all our own selves to God? So what is that? How does that hit you? Um, what are we? What are our verbs right now? I'm not going to give you the answers. I want to hear from you. Let me know what you think. See me in church on Sunday or send me an email or something. But what are our verbs right now? What are our main verbs? Moving on. Chapter 7, verses 11 to 20. This whole thing, verses really 12 through 26, I think, is an official document in Aramaic, which was same language Jesus would speak, this language of the land. King Artaxerxes of Persia uses the local language to authorize Ezra to carry out the rebuilding project the rest of the way, to bring more exiles back to Jerusalem, and to reestablish Torah law and practices there among the people. The main focus throughout most of Ezra is worship practices. Don't have the building yet all the way done. That's okay. We're still going to dedicate some things. We're going to offer sacrifices at the altar. What do we do the first thing we get there? We have a service of worship. Yeah. That's always the first thing, because that's what God asks the people to do, is to follow the ordinances and carry out the Sabbath, offer those burnt offerings, observe the festivals, all the thing that made God's people God's people. That's what they're trying to get back to. And so the main focus is on these worship practices. Um, in verses 21 to 24, after this, we'll see that Persia is requiring Babylon and the province that's called the beyond the river, so kind of Judah, Israel, that whole surrounding area. Um, those outside of Jerusalem are supposed to supply sacrificial animals and funds for Israel and to protect the work that they're doing. So not only, yes, they're allowed to, but you're going to help. It's almost like the big brother or the big sister is complaining about something, and like, oh, guess what? Now you get to help little sister. Uh, Too bad, little brother. So here's chapter 7, verses 11 to 20. After this, oops, wrong spot. There we go. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to the priest Ezra, the scribe, a scholar of the text of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to the priest Ezra, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven. Peace. And now I decree that any of the people of Israel or their priests or Levites in my kingdom who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with you. For you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your hand, and also to convey the silver and gold that the king and his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem, with all the silver and gold that you shall find in the whole province of Babylonia, and the ones that took them into exile, um, and with the freewill offerings of the people and the priests, given willingly for the house of their God in Jerusalem. With this money, then, you shall with all diligence buy bulls, rams, and lambs, and their grain offerings and their drink offerings, and you shall offer them on the altar of the house of your God in Jerusalem. Whatever seems good to you and your colleagues to do with the rest of the silver and gold, you may do, according to the will of your God. The vessels that have been given you for the service of the house of your God you shall deliver before the God of Jerusalem, and whatever else is required for the house of your God, which you are responsible for providing, you may provide out of the king's treasury. So, totally official, authorized, the whole 9 yards. So, as I was reading this, I wondered, I saw some parallels. Maybe you do too. Do you see any parallels between this story and then stories like Joseph in Egypt, or Daniel in Babylon, Esther and Persia? Stories of how God uses even enemy territory and rulers to help Israel prosper. Things go bad, oftentimes it's the consequences to Israel's own sins or actions, and then God still works through the hard circumstances, the enemies, to bring good things. God brings good from hardship or even evil. So there's these parallels, I think. Uh, Ponder that. Read those other stories. Maybe see what you think. Draw your own conclusions. And then I wonder, how has God helped us to prosper during our pandemic times? Are there unexpected sources of support? Uh, is there anything from the enemy of lockdown, that the enemy of a virus and contagiousness that has helped us, that will help us moving forward? So, how has God helped us to prosper during our pandemic times? Again, there's some new ministries. Maybe there's some new energy. Maybe there's a chance to refocus, rededicate, see the bigger picture again. Our routine has been shaken up. I don't know. I feel like the answer is yes. Yes, there are unexpected sources of support, but maybe we haven't fully figured them out yet. We'll see. Skipping ahead a little bit, Ezra chapter 7, verses 25 and 26. And you, Ezra, according to the God-given wisdom you possess, appoint magistrates and judges who may judge all the people in the province beyond the river, who know the laws of your God, and you shall teach those who do not know them. Just pausing for a quick second. So Ezra is given these mandates of his own to follow from the Persian rulers. So he's supposed to set up these magistrates and judges to enforce, oversee, guide the readoption of the law. However, pay close attention to the next verse, verse 26. All who will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be strictly executed on them, whether for death, or for banishment, or for the confiscation of their goods, or for imprisonment. So all who will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king. Explicit in all of the blessings and allowances that Persia is granting to the Hebrew people is the indisputable fact that they are not, after all, completely free. They're still ruled. There are consequences for disobedience to Persia alongside all these religious freedoms and funding they're receiving. A definite carrot and stick. Yeah, we'll let you do all your stuff. Yeah, build your temple. Take all this money. Take it from Babylon, the ones you're in exile from. Even better. You don't have to listen to these peoples in the land. You can govern yourselves and get this going. You have our blessing. However, just remember, if you mess up and disobey the king, there'll still be harsh consequences. There's still an or else going on. So there's still that sword hanging over them. And yet, despite that, when you look at verses 27 and 28, it switches to first person. And you hear Ezra, just saying, "Thank you, God. Oh, thank you so much. Um, so grateful that you're granting us this ability to do this. That you put it in the heart of the ruler of Persia to to do this for us." And it says that the hand of God was still on Ezra. Um, it's an interesting change right there. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our ancestors, who put such a thing as this into the heart of the king to glorify the house of the Lord. God always works within our contexts, whether it's times of peace or war, smooth sailing or hardship, exile or homecoming. The supreme example of this is the Word made flesh, Jesus the Christ, who lived as a human among humans. Um, God worked through the kings of Persia, yes, but God also worked through Ezra and the other leaders in Jerusalem. And God's always working, no matter what. The issue is that humanity and sin will always mar what God is trying to do. But God is tireless in God's mercy, nonetheless. Even though we screw up, even though we take what God is asking us to do and twist it or miss it, God is merciful. So our own context today is not like Ezra's. We're not trying to reestablish a nation state. But right now, as we return to normal worship patterns, we do have an opportunity to rededicate ourselves to God and God's mission in the world. So I wonder, where's God at work? Where's God's hand again? But then, what are the mandates from God that are guiding us? And then what human mandates do we have to navigate right now? So Persia had these things. You better do this stuff or else. But from God and from the scriptures, Ezra knew that they needed to reestablish these uh, identifying marks of what it meant to be God's people. Worship practices, festivals, sacrifices, in their case. So where's ours right now? Uh, are there any restrictions on our faith and its practices? In theory, no. According to the Constitution, Bill of Rights, First Amendment, separation of church and state, religious freedoms, doesn't always get applied equally across the board. Some folks would argue political correctness or whatever it is rearing its ugly head sometimes, and we're not allowed to do what we want to do. But on the whole, when you look at other places like China, which would kill a missionary or drive people out, look at different stories from the history of Christianity, there's nothing like some of the persecution Christians faced at other times and places. For the most part, really, folks, we're able to worship how we want to. Um, so I do wonder what are the pressures or the mandates that we're feeling as a church right now that keeps us from being God's people? And what are the mandates from God that we're trying to live up to and live through as well? Um, it's a tricky balance for Ezra, for Nehemiah in the next book. Um, I don't know. We're going to mess things up, but we're going to do the best we can. God's going to keep working through us. God's going to work through the context that we're currently in. So We might get caught up in the way things used to be, but maybe we need to start looking for what God is doing right now, or both. Learn from before, bring it into the present, and see what God's up to right now and bring that into the future. Moving along. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 20. It's a long section. It's a census of the second wave of returning exiles. Verses 15 to 20 in particular are about making sure that there's a contingent of Levites making the trip. Again, the focus for Ezra is on religious practices. We'll see later in Nehemiah that was more state concerns, building a wall, defense, things like that. But for Ezra, it was religion, worship, things like that. Verses 24 to 30 are about preparing the gifts, all the monies from the treasury, to send to the temple treasury. And then verses 31 to 34 about distributing those gifts to the various priests and Levites to be used the way they're supposed to be used. So we're not going to read all of that, but I do want to look at verses 21 to 23 of chapter 8. So we get the census, and then Ezra says, "Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river Ahava, that we might deny ourselves before God, to seek from him a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our possessions. For I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and cavalry to protect us against the enemy on our way, since we had told the king that the hand of our God is gracious to all who seek him, but his power and his wrath are against all who forsake him. So we fasted and petitioned our God for this, and he listened to our entreaty." I mean, if you think about it, Ezra is about to transport a very large sum of money and goods on what it would have been about a 4-month journey. Lots of opportunities for ambush and attack and robbery along the way. So he wanted to show the Persians that God will protect them on their journey. They don't need extra military help. God's going to get them there on their own. But because of the reality of what that road would bring, Ezra declared this fast before they departed. Um, According to one commentator, fasting seems to have been a symbolic entering of a near-death state, so as to represent oneself as an endangered person who is in need of divine care. Okay, so you deny yourself, you fast, you show that you're relying on God. It's not like Jesus says, it's not like the hypocrites going like, "Oh, I'm fasting, I'm so hungry, look at me." But it's a personal thing and a worshipful thing to center yourself back on God. So I wonder, did we use any of this quarantine as a time of fasting, as we were left without things? Um, did we take that as a time of fasting to rely on God all the more when we didn't have some of the things we usually have? And then I also wondered, most Americans, we lead pretty comfortable lives. I'm sitting here on my front porch, siding, house, air conditioning. Not sitting in it currently. But so we've got a pretty comfortable lifestyle here in our country, especially compared to many other people and places in the world. Even some of our, low income strata still doing better than a lot of places in the world. Um, doesn't mean we shouldn't try to help them. I'm just saying by comparison. Um, in what ways do we signify to God, to one another, to ourselves, that we are indeed vulnerable and in need of God's care, especially when I don't know, doing all right. I'm good. You need anything? No, I'm good. Um, is that just a Lenten thing that we do? Like, I will give up chocolate. I will give up television. Or do we ever intentionally let ourselves be vulnerable to rely on God all the more? That gets us through kind of the first phase. I'm going to finish up the book with chapters 9 and 10. Scholars and interpreters agree that chapters 9 and 10 of Ezra present some ethical difficulties, to say the least, for us modern readers today. As we highlighted in chapter 8, verse 26, Ezra and the other leaders were trying to maintain the balance between independence for Judah and still loyalty to Persia with their carrot and their stick. In these final 2 chapters, Ezra establishes a really hard-line interpretation of the law to consolidate and centralize priestly authority and religious unity and find some shelter between rocks and hard places, between Persia and the peoples of the land, exile and homecoming. So I can see what Ezra's trying to do. Um, and later generations would call Ezra the hero who preserves Judah and the law. But the way in which he gets to that goal is tragic. That's an understatement. So we're going to read the whole of chapter 9. So we'll just jump right in. You're going to hear Ezra reference some passages or make allusions to passages from Deuteronomy, Leviticus, 2 Kings, but he's going to interpret them much more strictly than they had originally been applied. So here we go. Chapter 9. After these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, "The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons. Thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands, and in this faithlessness the officials and leaders have led the way." When I heard this, I tore my garment and my mantle, and pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat appalled. Then all who trembled at the words of the God of Israel, because of the faithlessness of the returned exiles, gathered around me while I sat appalled until the evening sacrifice. At the evening sacrifice, I got up from my fasting with my garments and my mantle torn, and fell on my knees, spread out my hands to the Lord my God, and said, "Oh my God, I am too ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our ancestors to this day, we have been deep in guilt. And for our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been handed over to the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as is now the case. But now, for a brief moment, favor has been shown by the Lord our God, who has left us a remnant and given us a stake in his holy place, in order that he may brighten our eyes and grant us a little sustenance in our slavery. For we are slaves. Yet our God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us his steadfast love before the kings of Persia, to give us new life, to set up the house of our God, to repair its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judea and Jerusalem. And now, our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, The land that you are entering to possess is a land unclean with the pollutions of the peoples of the lands, with their abominations. They have filled it from end to end with their uncleanness. Therefore do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, so that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. After all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserved, and have given us such a remnant as this, shall we break your commandments again, and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you destroy us without remnant or survivor? O Lord, God of Israel, you are just. We have escaped as a remnant, as is now the case. Here we are before you in our guilt, though no one can face you because of this. Um, when we talk about the peoples of the lands here that have intermarried with the Jewish leaders, they're listed as the Canaanites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Amorites, etc. Those people didn't exist anymore in Ezra's time. There were some Egyptians and Moabites around, but there was a rule about not marrying Moabites. Um, but then you have the story of Ruth and Naomi. Naomi was a Moabite, so there you go with that. The Egyptians, I mean, yeah, they spent some time there in exile, but Joseph turned things around. And then, yeah, there was the not exile, sorry, during the famine. And then that turns into slavery there, but God gets them out of there. By the time we get back, you know, they're telling stories more about how once you were exiles, exiles and aliens in Egypt, so you better treat others nicely too. They use it as a teachable moment. According to one of the notes in the study Bible, The names, those names, Hittites, Perizzites, all of that, they come from an old stereotyped list of foreign nations with whom intermarriage was forbidden. It was boilerplate. And they're mentioned here to invoke the ancient law as relevant to the current situation. So here's the justification for why this is bad, because it was bad before. So we got to take care of this. How they take care of it, we'll see in chapter 10. That's kind of the tragic part. Before we get there, though, just to ask, what's the farthest you've ever bent in interpretation of Scripture? I mean, you could do it pretty easy, like, oh well, um, for instance, the Lord's Prayer. It's the easiest one. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Literally in the Greek, that translates to something like, forgive us our trespasses to the same degree that we forgive those who trespass against us. You know, I mean, come on. Do we really hear it that way as we're praying it every time? Or is it just God forgive us as we forgive? You know, we'll forgive them and you forgive us all at the same time. It's not a conditional thing. Um, we don't want to hear it as a conditional thing. We're Lutherans. We're all about grace. Dang it. Um, yeah. How does that work? How do you bend that to make that work for you? Yeah, I forgive people. Um, and then I also wonder, as Ezra is tearing his clothes and pulling his beard and lamenting before God about the faithlessness of the church, in what ways is the church faithful now? It could be our congregation, Big C Church, denomination, or the whole thing. Um, in what ways is the church not faithful? We are the people of the gospel. We're not the people of the law. So how do we preach the good news, the gospel, that we've been brought back by God's grace from the exile of sin? God brought us back from sin and separation and made us one with Christ, made us ambassadors for Christ, gave us good news to share. How are we doing with that? How faithful are we as the church? Should we be tearing our clothes and pulling at our beards? Where are we at? What would your assessment be, the church right now? Chapter 10. I'm going to read verses 1 through 15 in chunks. So, first 1 through 5. While Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel. The people also wept bitterly. Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, of the descendants of Elam, addressed Ezra, saying, We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now let us make a covenant with our God to send away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God. And let it be done according to the law. Take action, for it is your duty, and we are with you. Be strong and do it. Then Ezra stood up and made the leading priests, the Levites, and all Israel swear that they would do as had been said, so they swore. Okay, so what is the solution to this? Not circumcising people, not teaching them the law, not some type of conversion or something along those lines. No, the answer is get rid of all those wives and children. Send them away. Verses 6 through 8. Keep in mind as I read verses 6 through 8 that Jerusalem was 2,000 feet above sea level, and this was more than likely in December, which was the cold, rainy time, and they're up in an open plaza, up high in the high altitude, um, and it's wet, it's raining, okay? Then Ezra withdrew from before the house of God, and went to the chamber of Jehohanan, son of Eliashib, where he spent the night. He did not eat bread or drink water, for he was mourning over the faithlessness of the exiles. They made a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem to all the returned exiles that they should assemble at Jerusalem, and that if any did not come within 3 days, by their property, uh, by order of the officials and the elders, all their property should be forfeited, and they themselves banned from the congregation of the exiles. So they lose all their stuff, and like if they don't come to the summons, they lose everything they have. They're banned out of the congregation, so they're excommunicated and stripped of all their goods. Not a lot of choice there. You're going to show up, and it's going to be cold. Going on, verses 9 through 15. Then all the people of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within the 3 days. It was the 9th month, on the 20th day of the month. All the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You have trespassed and married foreign women, and so increased the guilt of Israel." Remember, there was a long delay in the temple buildings. Apparently, during that delay, they started marrying these other folks. Okay, so relative newlyweds and young children here. Now make confession to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives. Then all the assembly answered with a loud voice, "It is so, we must do as you have said. But the people are many, and it is a time of heavy rain. We cannot stand in the open. Nor is this a task for 1 day or for 2, for many of us have transgressed in this matter. Let our officials represent the whole assembly, and let all in our towns who have taken foreign wives come at appointed times, and with them the elders and judges of every town, until the fierce wrath of our God on this account is averted from us." Only Jonathan, son of Asahel, and Josiah, son of Tikva, opposed this, and Meshullam and Shabbathai, the Levites, supported them. One interpreter said that they opposed that it didn't go far enough, but most folks think they opposed sending away the wives and their children. Why is this problematic? A number of reasons. First of all, it's just cruel, plain and simple. Especially in that time when women and children were powerless. It was a patriarchal society. They weren't going to make it on their own. They'd go back to their families maybe if they took them back. Um, Instant refugees, instant homeless. Next, even though there are laws prohibiting intermarrying, and he quotes one at length, um, lost my place. Sorry. There we are. There's also stories of outsiders joining Israel through circumcision. There is the story of Ruth and Naomi that I just mentioned. Naomi was an outsider, but she comes back, ends up with Boaz, like Ruth does at least. Ruth was the outsider, sorry. So they come back, and Ruth marries in. It's all good. She ends up part of the lineage of Jesus, for crying out loud. They wouldn't have known that. But there are many other stories of God's blessings extending to or coming from foreigners. Think Naaman the leper, think a lot of New Testament examples, but think of all the times that God's grace is extended to others outside the covenant, or that others outside the covenant end up teaching something or being an example for the Israelites. Um, there's also the fact that the people exiling these wives and children had just returned themselves from a long and painful exile. So they're creating a whole slew, that there was 113 offenders of widows and orphans. Um, there's a ton of laws and statutes, way more than the intermarrying stuff, that specifically talk about protecting and caring for widows and orphans, not creating them. The law says to take care of them, not make more. Lastly, the law that was cited to allow this mass forced divorce comes from Deuteronomy chapter 24, which allows for a divorce on the grounds that the wife is unclean, according to the purity laws in the Torah. So what Ezra does here, is he says, well, if you are of foreign birth, you are just automatically unclean. So that's the tweak to the law. That's the leap that is made to allow the divorce. Now, then the law about divorce, it doesn't say what you do with them afterwards. It doesn't spell out what you're supposed to do. So this mass expulsion is also something new. And then from verse 18 on, you get the whole list of who was sent away, who had to send away their wives and children. So the deed is done. That's where Ezra ends, with verse 44. All these had married foreign women, and they sent them away with their children. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In general question: how do we handle hard passages like this, ones that make us uncomfortable? There's some really violent ones. There's some really troubling ones in the Bible. How do we handle this? This lesson, this isn't going to come up in the 3-year lectionary in the church. You know, we just kind of step around it sometimes. Martin Luther did talk about the canon within the canon. He said there are some passages that more clearly communicate Christ and the gospel, and you use those, like the Gospels, Paul's letters, and the Psalms. So Luther would say you use these that really lift up the gospel and show Christ. You use those to interpret these other ones that are harder to understand, like James or Revelation, or some of the laws in the Old Testament that would no longer have to be uh, lived out by Christians because Jesus fulfilled the law, or things like this that are just plain, just gross and shameful. Um, Also note that the decision that was made to do this was made by an assembly who was not very much affected by the decision personally. They sent people out to say, like, gather up all these offenders, not themselves so much. At least that's not how it's worded. Um, so they had nothing to lose in this decision. This was not something, and I double checked, this was not something that we heard God asking for directly in Ezra. This is, the people did this all on their own. Um, think of the story of the rape of Dinah, however you want to say it, in Genesis 34. Go back and read it if you're not familiar with it. But think of the way that Dinah's brothers react. The guy is like, "I love Dinah. I want to marry her. This will bring our peoples more closely together." And they're like, well, sure, you can marry her, but on one condition: you get circumcised and follow our laws and our rules. This is before the law, but you become a part of our people." And they're like, "Great." So all the guys get circumcised, and while they're still healing, the Israelites show up and murder them all. God didn't ask for that one either. I checked. Uh, are there other stories in the Bible or in your lives of people who do something on God's behalf that really isn't on God's behalf? The Crusades come to mind as a historical one. Because we can perhaps understand how Ezra arrived at this decision. Purity was so important. He's got pressure from Persia, pressure from the outsiders, needs to reestablish Israel. And the people come to him like, look, all these leaders married the outsiders. It's bad. This happened before. We ended up in exile. Plus, we don't like them. It's bad. Um, so we can understand it, that he thought this would be part of the solution. Purity, the holy seed, the remnant. And it is in the Bible, it's scripture. But we don't have to approve of what happened in these two chapters. But we can learn from it. We can learn how sin ricochets and multiplies and rebounds on the innocent, like these widows and orphans now. And even though it was presented under the heading of good intentions, or this will please God. So think about that. In what ways has the church inadvertently self-destructed its own members or its mission field, been hypocritical, hurt people? There's lots of stories of that. Stories of abuse by clergy, things like the Crusades, the Inquisition, uh, not stepping up in times of need, turning a blind eye to hurting people. There's so many stories, so many reasons why a lot of people don't trust church, don't go to church now. Because of things like this. Maybe this is an extreme example, but is it really? How many times in recent history have abused people asked the church for help and were told, oh, you made a covenant in marriage. I'm sorry, you got to stick with it, but you'll receive your reward in heaven. Um, Turned away for various reasons. Still happens. Still happens. So this is a troubling couple of chapters here, to say the least. I think I've probably given you a lot to chew on. This is longer than the last couple of weeks, and it's less chapters. Um, as the study is titled, New Normals Are Messy. So as we gather together again, as we get back in the building and get our teams and committees going and all of this stuff, as we gather back together and as we plan for the future, let us pray that God blesses our ministry and protects us, when necessary, from ourselves. For next week, we're going to read Nehemiah chapters 8 and 9. That's supposed to fit more with this part of the story that we've been reading. We'll get back to the rest of Nehemiah later on. So next week, Nehemiah chapters 8 and 9, much shorter. We'll balance out this week's lesson. But this is just one of those passages. It's a lot to think about. chew about, pray about, and I hope that you do. Let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts, and continue to pray for one another and share the good news. Word indeed. Share God's love. Uh, that's it. I'll stop talking. See you next time. Be well. Peace be with you. Go in peace. Serve the Lord.